So what is error handling and how would you implement it in your project in Swift? So I'll give you an example of how I'm going to implement it, and then I'll show you a few ways to improve it. All right, so we'll start with this. This is just a basic API request, basic API GET request. There's a few things that can go wrong when you're making an API request. The very first thing is that you're creating a URL, which could fail if the URL is broken or if it doesn't lead to a proper website. Another way it could fail is if we fail to create this URL session for that URL. If we get a response back from the server, that's not what we're expecting. If it wasn't a successful connection to the server, that's another place it could fail. And then lastly here, if we have a problem decoding, this in my experience tends to be the most common point of failure in an API request, is decoding the data that we get back as JSON into whatever we want. In this case, we're just decoding it as a string. So right now this works, but it doesn't do much because we haven't done anything with our string result. So let's just say that to change this right off the bat, we'll just say we want to return that string result. So go to the top of our function and we'll hit return. We'll add return string. So now we're promising at the end of this, we are going to return a string. And we're going to return our string result. Now, this introduces a few problems because in these other cases where those problems might exist, and we were previously just returning nothing if there was a problem, well, now we've promised it a string. When we hit this function, we promised it a string, and that string is no longer successful in these cases, right? So this is a place that you might want to use a throwing function. Right? So we're no longer going to be returning this. Instead, we're going to mark this as throws. So this can throw an error if we come across one. So we will say here, we'll get rid of all these return statements because they're no longer valid. And this is where we're going to be returning our error should we come across one. Okay. So we've made room for our errors. A good way to create a definition for your errors is you create an enum. I'm going to use a public enum here just because in this API request, I'm going to have a lot of them in my app. So I'm going to make it public and available everywhere. We'll say API service error. And we're going to make this conform to the error protocol, which is an empty protocol, but all it does is tell Swift that this is a type of error. And so because this is an enum, we're going to need some cases. We'll say the first one is a bad URL. The next one is going to be a bad session. So we'll say, what are we going to say? We'll say request error. And then we'll say status. If our status is not equals to 200, which is a successful message, we're going to give it the error code of status not okay. And lastly, we're going to have another error for decoding. So we'll say decoding error. All right, and so that's all we're going to do so far. Now where we had our returns, which are no longer valid, we're going to say, instead of returning nothing, we'll say throw API service error .bad URL. So in the case that we are not able to convert our URL string into a URL, like for example, maybe if we just have an empty string that we pass in, this is going to throw an error. We will throw this API service error .bad URL. We'll do the same thing here. We'll say throw API service error, and this is going to be a request error. Again, for here, we'll say status is not okay if it's not 200. So we'll say throw API service error .status not okay, and a decoding error. So we'll say throw API service error .decoding error. So that should satisfy all of our messages here. Now, if this is successful, it will return our string result, which is our decoded data. But in any of these other cases, it's going to throw that error. So what can we do with that error? So let's say in our code, in our view, we can try to run this function, and we're going to, if there's an error, we can catch it and do something with that error. So we'll say there's going to be a do catch block. We'll say try awaits our basic API call. And if there's an error, we'll say catch API service error dot bad URL. So what do we want to do in the case that there is a bad URL when we try this? So I'm going to show you another way to do this later because this is going to get a little bit long and not really necessary if you are using this throwing function in many different places. You don't want to have a huge catch block, and I'll show you in a second. We're going to have to do the same thing for each of these possible throwing errors. So catch API service error dot status not okay, and catch API service error for decoding error. So now if this throws a bad URL, what do we want to do with it? Well, we could say print bad URL. And that'll come up in our console here if we do have a bad URL. Or we could say show an alert message, trigger an alert message with this description to the user. Or we could log it, or we could do many other different things so we can kind of figure out what's going on with this and what the problem might be. So this gets a little clunky, and it's not as easily reusable elsewhere because you don't want to have this big long do catch block with multiple things in it. So I'm going to show you an easier way to do that. We'll just get rid of this, and we'll keep our do statement there. We're going to add an extension to our API service error. So we'll say extension on API service error. And now this one, because it's inheriting from its parent, it already inherits this error. But now in this extension, we're going to add, localized error. So this is going to conform to a localized error. And we'll say public var error description is an optional string. And we're going to calculate this property. So we'll say a switch statement, switch for self. Okay, wait, why is this not working? Switch self usually expands everything for me. I'm not sure why it's not doing that. Okay, we'll just say case dot bad URL, and we'll say case dot request error, case dot status not okay, and case dot decoding error. So in a situation where we are throwing a bad URL, what we want to do is return a string that's kind of describes this a little bit better. So we'll say here for bad URL, this is the way I like to do it. I have a little emoji here just so I can see it. If I'm just printing it, it helps it become a little bit more visible in your console. So you could be a little bit more descriptive of that. We could just say like, there was an error with the URL. For example, if we're showing an alert to the user, maybe it makes sense to be a little bit more descriptive or something like that. There was an error creating the URL session, and so on and so on, right? So we'll just say like status is not equals 200. Well, for here, we'll just say status not okay, and decoding error, but you can make it whatever you want. So now that we've established this extension we go back to our do catch block. Instead of having that long list of catches, we can just say catch let error. So this is going to create a variable, or a constant of what our error is, and we can just say print our error dot localized description. So now when this prints, it's gonna know wherever it was thrown. If it was service area dot request error, it's going to run through the switch statement, request error, and it's going to return as our localized description. There was an error creating this session. So this makes it a lot easier to create these error cases, a lot less code to implement down the road, and it is a lot more descriptive for us when we are trying to figure out why an API request is not working, or what other function that you're running, if there's other problems that could be going on. It helps us figure out where those problems are and how to solve them. All right, so thanks for watching, and have a good day.